Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Give the People What They Want, your one spot weekly show for news from movements, news of struggles from across the world. I'm Prasanth, I'm a journalist from India, and with me is Roger McKenzie of the Morning Star. We are missing Zoe this week, who's not able to join, but she'll be back next week with stories from across the world as well. We have a very important set of stories we are going to be talking about struggles, repression, but also struggles against repression in Palestine, in the United States. New signs of hope in the Sahel. We'll be talking about all this in this show, so keep watching.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Right, we're going to begin with Palestine, where a lot has happened in the past week. There's hardly a week where we don't talk about the news there, the horrific genocidal onslaught that Israel has been conducting for almost over 1.5 years now, and there's been there's been a big question in a lot of our conversations, a lot of reporting across the world that where is the kind of solidarity that you see. And this does not mean there hasn't been any solidarity. We've seen protests, of course, across the world taking place. And we have seen, protests, and many of those protests not being covered at all. One reason why you may not be seeing it. We are not seeing solidarity from the governments is what we mean. And I think that is continued. But what activists have been doing is that they have been, I think, raising this question to the fore, bringing it to the fore, not only to their own governments, but also to people across the world, to governments across the world. And there are two instances we want to talk about this week. One is the widely reported Freedom Flotilla, of course, the ship Madeleine, which carried Greta Thunberg and a variety of other activists who tried to break the blockade on Gaza, the sea blockade on Gaza, by delivering humanitarian goods. Now, just a few weeks ago, another ship, part of the Freedom Flotilla called the Conscience, was bombed was attacked rather by drones and was basically not able to sail. And after that, the Madeleine started moving towards Gaza. And from the very beginning, Israeli authorities made it very clear that they would not allow the boat to fulfill its mission, which was to deliver vital, essential humanitarian goods to Gaza. Now, all of you must have seen those reports. Israeli soldiers boarding the ship, taking it to their port and deporting some of the activists. The others are likely to stand some kind of trial, also accompanied by threats, mockery, all kinds of scorn by Israeli forces, an attempt to delegitimize them, not just stop them, but to delegitimize them, trying to paint them as some kind of celebrities who were just doing some kind of a gimmick. But I think people across the world do realize that this breaking the blockade is one of the key aspects, one of maybe the highest forms of solidarity that people who are outside Gaza, who are outside Palestine, can achieve at this point of time, or can try for at this point of time. There's similarly another land caravan, which is also making its way, activists from across the world. And I think this points to an increasing sentiment across the world that this really can't be allowed to go on anymore. And and the fact it's important to note that I think that activists continue to do this and to raise those questions before, like I said, before the governments of the world. Very important, by the way, to note that none of the governments of the West really raised much of a uproar over their citizens being arrested by Israeli forces. A very important question. Otherwise, always speaking about human rights, many of these governments, but why? In fact, in the case of France, a member of the European Parliament was among those arrested, but you did not see France, going all out to declare, its opposition to Israel or to condemn Israel. Why? That question fundamentally remains. So, initiatives of solidarity like this are very important because I think they place front and center the question of why these governments are refusing to take any action when the signs of genocide are so clearly before all of us. And it's important to note that trying to break this blockade is so important because right now I think about 95% of the population of Gaza is facing some kind of a very severe food crisis. The latest numbers are really disturbing. You'll find a lot of media reports about that as well. And it's not just food in isolation. It's also a destruction of health facilities. It's also destruction of water, clean water facilities. All of them really working together to create this horrible situation in Gaza, along with the attacks as well. Of course, we have reports of people being killed in large numbers every day as well by the Israeli forces. So I think all of this for activists and movements across the world pose this fundamental question. So do follow what's happening with the, the land, the caravan against the blockade as well. Very important aspect of solidarity. We've seen once again the Freedom Flotilla becoming a moment for activists across the world to reignite those protests, to make them stronger, to bring in more people into the fold. And that's really the only one of the only ways in which you can hold governments to account, governments which are either backing Israel or staying silent, which is again being complicit in genocide. So very important to keep track and in whatever ways possible support that solidarity with the people of Gaza. But Roger, coming back, talking about solidarity, we've got a slate of stories which have to do with protests, struggling for alternatives, trying to define ways out in this very difficult world around us. There's been a session of the People's Assembly, I believe, in the United Kingdom, which itself is a very interesting concept. So do take us through what's been happening there.
Yeah, so the People's Assembly Against Austerity held a march on last Saturday, through central London. One of the things at the moment, of course, is there's been lots of marches, people protesting against the genocide in Gaza, for example, and virtually something every week. So there was a kind of expectation, I think, or kind of worry that the numbers would be small and that people were in kind of demonstration fatigue. Nothing could have been further from the truth, actually. People turned out through central London in their tens of thousands, protesting against the cuts that are being put through by the Starmer government. And it's really important that what we are seeing is people not accepting the fact that the sort of cuts that Starmer's Labour government is putting through are just going to be accepted. One of the ways that Starmer's government is doing these cuts is they have been really, really clear that not only are they cutting the welfare benefits budget, but the money is going into the military. They are really clear that the money is going into supporting an imaginary war that they think they're in with Russia in particular. But of course, there's a lot of that money that's going into supporting the genocide in Gaza as well. So Starmer is under pressure from the people who are seeing through this. And one of the things that is he's been forced to roll back on is the idea of cutting a winter fuel allowance. Now, this is a long-standing allowance that's given, particularly for older people, to be able to help them get through the kind of harsh winters. And the government decided to cut that allowance and make it much harder to get. And there was all sorts of protests about it. The government's popularity plummeted. They lost out in the polls in May, in the county council elections. And I mean, just general condemnation of this sort of approach where they were making the most vulnerable in society pay for the military, essentially. Well, they've had to roll back on that because of the pressure that's been applied. And those tens of thousands of people who went through London on Saturday were part of that pressure. But that pressure has not stopped just because they've decided to roll back on that winter fuel allowance. There's still much more that needs to happen to make sure that this kind of phony war that seems to be being set up with the Russians is stopped. And I think people are mobilizing in great numbers, not just at a national level, but they're looking to mobilize at a local level as well. And one of the calls that's being made is that, well, and I think people are increasingly understanding, is that why, instead of building, as Starmer said, 12 new nuclear submarines at billions and billions of pounds worth, why don't we put that money into schools which are falling to pieces in Britain, or many hospitals which are also falling to pieces in Britain? Let's have the best education and the best health service that money can buy, rather than putting it into the military. So I think people are increasingly understanding that, and that's why these protests will continue to take place. So well done to the People's Assembly against austerity, and we all need to continue those protests on the street to make sure the point gets home to the Starmer government.
Right, Roger. I mean, you mentioned the term phony war. Very interesting in the context of the next story. And in a way, phony wars are, it's a useful term, because I think it kind of also disguises a real war that is taking place. And what is happening in the United States right now is Donald Trump and his administration pretending that there is a warlike scenario and that they're mounting some kind of great defense of their country, whereas what is actually taking place is a war by this very government on the working people of that country, on some of the poorest people of that country. And I think this, erupted last week. We saw, of course, headlines across the world, massive protests taking place, beginning in Los Angeles, of course, where members of the very notorious ICE, that is the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, tried to arrest immigrants in the city of Los Angeles, and were met by massive protests. Now, I think, there is, this, of course, has been widely reported, but from our perspective, there are, I think, questions we need to ask, and, about some of this reporting, as well as some of the perspectives around it. And I think, as one, it's important to point out that the media, a lot of the media will want you to see this as some kind of, for lack of a better word, rioting in the city of Los Angeles. Whereas what is actually taking place is a vast nationwide set of protests, which are continuing, by the way. Like I said, you won't find too much of this maybe in the mainstream media, but protests have been taking place every day, including yesterday while we're recording. Of course, I presume they'll take place today also. But especially until yesterday, massive protests, many cities across the United States protesting against how ICE and other federal agencies have been detaining immigrants as part of Donald Trump's and his associates' plan. Now, it's very clear that what Trump is really trying to do, Trump and his associates, is also, of course, reference to Stephen Miller, who is one of his prime henchmen in this. What they're trying to do is basically, distract from their multiple failures, from the complete collapse of the so-called agenda or the promises Trump made to alleviate the suffering of the working class by pointing the finger at the most marginalized sections in the society. It's a very, very, very old trick in the book. And the only way to do this, of course, is to make it seem like immigrants are the problem, and to criminalize them, and to militarize the whole of society, if possible, against them. And that's really been Trump's agenda. And during his first term, you remember the wall and campaign slogans like that. And that's what's been his agenda now also. In fact, if anything, it's grown more sophisticated. And of course, he's been talking about, he's deployed the Marines, he's deployed the National Guard, despite there being no request from the governor of the state. But I think it's very important for readers, viewers, to actually look at this issue and, one, see that this, to not fall into the trap of seeing this in how as some kind of an issue of rioting, which is always how the mainstream media, the corporate media, would like to portray people's protests. In fact, throughout history, that's been the case. And I think the second important thing is also in fact, there have been other reporters who have also been pointed out to get the voices of people on the ground, and the variety of organizations taking part on this. You have trade unions, you have community organizations, you have religious organizations, a whole host of organizations, common people who, I've been reading reports of people on the ground saying that they feel what is being done is wrong. They feel they feel that the persecution of working poor people is wrong. They feel that targeting these people is wrong, and arresting them and detaining them and deporting them and whatever, all of that is just wrong. So many people coming into the street with those sentiments. And the federal action has actually sought to crack down on all these elements. We saw a prominent union leader being arrested, further protests taking place against that arrest as well. So I think very important to understand the both the breadth of the organizers, the protesting organizations, the people involved, and the depth of the issues that are involved in this. And I think that is where, so much, especially in in today's time, with social media, with the kind of fast transmission of certain visuals that come about, it's very easy to sort of paint the protest and as a very monolithic thing, and which is deliberate, and kind of ignore the vast scope of that protest. So I think it's very essential that we see this protest not fall into the trap of the corporate media, which wants to stigmatize protesters, which wants to make them seem like some kind of what is our antisocial elements of the words we use here, and rather see them as representing a very decisive voice among the people from all sections, from all classes. So I think very important couple of days coming ahead as well. So let's see what happens. People definitely on the streets across the country. Very, very important moment. And Donald Trump can talk about the Insurrection Act. Donald Trump can talk about the invaders and aliens and all that kind of stuff. But the streets are giving the true response, which is that it's the people united who are calling for their rights, who are saying that we will not stand for this anymore. So I think a very, very important week always has passed, a very important week coming ahead. And I think, Roger, it's very apt that you're going to be talking about something very similar as well, just across the ocean, a very similar set of issues perhaps, but again, what is uniting it is the anger and the protests that are taking place.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that's uniting this and this story that I'll follow with about Italy is that it's got racism at its core, really, as a kind of fault line that runs between each of these three stories. In Northern Ireland, we have seen major disturbances on the streets of Ballymena, which is in County Antrim. And what's happened is that two teenagers were arrested and taken to court for sexual assault on a young woman. They haven't been found guilty of anything yet, but this is what they're accused of. They've pled not guilty. But soon after the court hearing on Monday, there was a peaceful protest about what had happened. These two young people are Romanian. But that soon turned into a violent racist protest, frankly. The cars were burned in the streets. There was houses attacked. In fact, at one time, Prasanth, what happened was that local people in Ballymena were putting up signs in their doors, in their windows, to say British people live here, or no Romanians live here, things like that. They were putting those sort of signs up so they wouldn't be attacked. So everybody within the locality knew what was happening, knew the roots of these problems, loads of police got injured, but loads of property, loads of kind of cars, as I said earlier on, were also damaged. But what it's also meant is that there's a whole immigrant community that's built up over 10, 15, 20 years in Northern Ireland that is now in fear of leaving their homes every day. I know this feeling from years back when, Black people in Britain were accused of everything that went wrong everywhere. But more to the point, more recently, of course, this has eerie overtones of what happened last year in Britain, where there were major disturbances on the streets because people of Asian descent were accused of carrying out attacks locally, and most of that was absolute rubbish and untrue. But the far right, the racists, took hold of what was happening and turned this into disturbances on the streets. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the coming days. That kind of brings all this stuff under control. But it's quite interesting how the First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, from Sinn Féin, how she said that we have to be really clear about what's taking place here and that it's racist and there's no point in dressing this up. The problem is when you let this genie out of the bottle, when this comes out and it starts to happen and disturbances start, the far right organizations start to move in and take advantage of these things. And it seems that that's what's happening now. So let's hope for calm, but let's also hope for the left starting to organize a resistance to these attacks as well, so that the local people can feel comfortable that they're not going to be attacked in the streets or in their own homes. And this is kind of similar to what's going on in Italy, really. So for years in Italy, there's been problems where Africans in particular have faced harassment in the streets, have faced difficulties in terms of getting jobs, in terms of just the whole thing about citizenship. So for years, it's been the case that even if you're born in Italy, if your parents are not Italian themselves, then your path to citizenship is really difficult. I mean, it's something like to be able to get residency. It has been 10 years, and that kind of prompted the trade union movement in Italy, as well as the left organisations as well, to put forward a referendum, which was held last Sunday, to try and get more employment rights, but also to increase the opportunities to gain citizenship. So instead of having that 10-year residency qualification, it was going to come down to 5 years and so on. The problem was, to get that referendum through, you needed to have more. You needed to get 50% plus one to be able to get the vote through. The vote was only around 30% in the end, after an organised boycott of the votes by the fascist Prime Minister's party, Giorgia Meloni's party, and they were really pleased that the referendum failed to get to its number. But Meloni even went, said that, and did go to the voting station, stood outside, and refused to go in. And that's what the far right did, because they knew the more people didn't go in, the more likely it was that the vote wasn't going to succeed. One of the really sad parts of this is that of the people who did vote, that the in favor of these changes was running at something like 80%. So it was, had massive popularity in terms of the people who took part. Now, the left and the trade union movement in Italy said this is not something that they're going to let go. It's something they're going to continue to push, along with refugee groups, along with asylum groups, along with migrant workers groups across Italy. And the important thing is that the trade union movement has recognised the need to do something to stand up for all of these workers who lack basic employment rights in the workplace, as well as the citizenship issue. It's also about just the right to have basic employment rights in the workplace. So they need to continue to push that. They're saying they will, but they're also pointing out that this is a basic blow to democracy across Italy. And what I would suggest is, as well as that kind of those sorts of comments, there also needs to be much more done to protect migrants, to protect immigrants walking across the streets of Italy, who are just routinely harassed by the authorities, as they are in other places across Europe as well. So a blow for those people seeking to give rights to immigrants into Italy, but I don't think this is something that the left and the trade union movement in Italy are going to let go. So let's hope not.
Right, Roger. I mean, I think throughout this show, we've talked about countries in the global north, the what used to be called developed countries, run or continue their policy of racism, of exclusion, of of building further walls of all kinds, physical walls, but also figurative walls to separate people and politicians like Trump and Meloni and Netanyahu, exploiting that further and exploiting those fissures further. But I think we'll end on a slightly separate note, and often that separate note for us comes from the Sahel region, and this week is no different. The Alliance of Sahel States has made some interesting decisions recently, and one of them has been to set up a court, which is now called the Sahelian Criminal and Human Rights Court. That's the CPSDH. Now, this is of course, it sounds like, it sounds bureaucratic. It sounds okay, it's a court. What's the big difference or what's the big deal? But the fact is actually that this is yet another step in these three countries, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, working very closely together at a time when they really need to work close together, considering the jihadist offensives that are taking place. We have ISIS and the JNIM and other organizations. So it's actually a very important moment for two reasons. One, it's a concerted effort to actually bring justice to those who are involved in these kind of operations. But it is also, I think, an attempt to sort of work together and, create their own institutions, in this case, to bring justice itself, which in itself is a very important aim. And I think one of the big ways in which the global north has actually, extended its dominion over the entire world is by institutionalizing every aspect of political life, whether it be law, whether it be trade, whether it be the question of justice. So much of this is by default both located in the global north in terms of the institutions that are there and in terms of the conditions and the laws through which the entire world is governed. So I think the fact that these three countries, all of which are not, the most developed countries in the world, although it's important to note that their economies have been drastically improving over the past couple of years. But nonetheless, these countries are not necessarily the most powerful in the world or the biggest in the world, or have the biggest armies. But the fact that they've come together to set up this kind of an institution, I think, is a very, very positive sign. And I think speaks to the vision which the leaders of these countries are pursuing. They've actually had their own passport now for the AES. They've had their own flag. And very recently, I would encourage you to go online, find it, and hear it. There is the new anthem of the AES that has also been released. It is very, very catchy. And I think, this harks back to the kind of projects that Africa had immediately after colonization. We had leaders like Kwame Nkrumah who were very invested in the idea of bringing many of these newly liberated countries together to exploit their resources, to tap into the potential of the people of these countries. But many of these experiments were torn into pieces by the former colonizers, by multinational corporations who just wanted to exploit the mineral wealth. And today, Africa is divided primarily because of that reason into 54 countries. Many of those arbitrary boundaries, the result of colonial decisions. So these kind of decisions, I think, by countries in the Sahel, for instance, are very, very important. They are also providing, I think, a vital alternative to institutions like ECOWAS, which are widely perceived by young Africans, especially, as just a tool of the French. I think these countries are showing, are presenting a model of how integration can look like. And I think it's very important to follow not only this kind of news about this integration, but about the economic, social, political developments taking place in these countries. People's Dispatch carried an excellent piece, I think, last week. It was called, by the Pan-Africanism Today Secretary, it's called Forging a New Pan-African Path, about Burkina Faso, about the AES countries. And while reading that, one thing I thought was that it's strange that all you read about these countries in the big media, in the AP, AFPs, and the Reuters, is about the jihadist attacks and how each of these countries is on the verge of collapse, and that's all you read about. And you get such a dismal picture of what's happening. But go beyond the scenes to places like People's Dispatch, to Morning Star, in fact, to many sources on social media who are highlighting this news, and you'll see people of these countries trying to carve their own path, trying to sort of tell the world that we're trying to do things differently here. We need your support on this. And this entire picture has completely been obscured. And I think which is why it's very, very important right now. And that article really focuses on that as well. in terms of why it's so important to pay attention to the Sahel, to express solidarity and support the Sahel, and to understand what is really happening in this region as something. I know it's not the experiment is not over. It's not a full-fledged success story. I mean, that it's never the case, right? It's always an evolving experiment. There are so many challenges ahead, and who knows how things will proceed. But what we do see right now is a very conscious attempt to to recover sovereignty and to define sovereignty in new ways, in economic, social, and political ways, in a way that gives the people of those countries pride in their belonging, in a way that gives people of those countries the feeling that they're no longer vassals of the French or the United States or whichever country just sends in its soldiers over there. So I think it's a very important moment, like we keep talking about on this show, to keep watching what's happening there, read beyond what these 2 or 3 sources tell you, and that's a fundamental, I think, definition of the agenda of what organizations like People's Dispatch and Morning Star and so many other independent journalists do, to go beyond the restrictions imposed or those walls created, since we've been talking so much about walls, to go beyond those walls created by a few news organizations and to get the true picture. So that's all we have today in this episode. We'll be back next week as well with Zoe to talk more about stories from across the world, stories of struggle as well, stories of resistance. And more importantly, I think, like we often conclude, that there is always, of course, repression, but there is resistance to repression too. And that those are the stories we aim to tell as much. So thank you and see you next week.